The Los Angeles evening hung warm and still, the kind of night where the city's usual chaos seemed to pause just long enough for something special to happen. Downtown, the historic Orpheum Theater glowed under soft golden lights, its marquee not advertising a movie or a show, but simply reading, Hope for Tomorrow, Youth Shelter Benefit. Inside, the air buzzed with a different kind of energy, not the frantic flash of a premiere, but the quiet hum of people who actually cared. There were donors in tailored suits, yes, but also social workers in comfortable blazers, volunteers in neat but simple clothes, and even a few young people from the shelter program themselves standing a little taller tonight, smiling shyly as they helped hand out programs. Among the guests arriving through the grand doors was Keanu Reeves. He didn't roll up in a blacked-out SUV with tinted windows. He walked, alone, wearing a plain black suit that looked like it had seen a few years of honest wear, a white shirt, no tie, no sunglasses even though the red carpet lights were bright, no publicist hovering at his elbow, no bodyguard clearing a path. He just showed up, like anyone else who'd gotten an invitation and decided to come. As he stepped onto the short red carpet section, more of a red runner really, he didn't strike a pose or scan the crowd for cameras. Instead, he stopped to thank the two volunteers holding the velvet ropes. He shook their hands, looked them in the eye, and said, "Thanks for doing this. It means a lot." One of them, a college student named Luis who'd been nervous all evening, later told his roommate his hand was still shaking, not from starstruck awe but from the way Keanu had spoken to him, like they were old friends catching up. Inside the lobby, the atmosphere was warm, almost intimate. Crystal chandeliers cast a gentle light over clusters of people chatting over sparkling water and light hors d'oeuvres. There was laughter, but it was the kind that came from real connection, not forced networking. Keanu moved through the space slowly, not seeking attention. He spotted the event's founder, an elderly woman named Helen who'd started the shelter after losing her own grandson to the streets years ago. He went straight to her, bent down slightly to hear her over the soft piano music and listened, really listened as she told him about the new dormitory they'd just finished building. He didn't interrupt. He didn't glance at his watch. He just nodded, asked thoughtful questions about the kids, and when Helen's voice cracked a little talking about one boy who'd just gotten his GED, Keanu gently touched her arm and said, "That's incredible. Helen, you're changing lives." It wasn't performative. It was human. Meanwhile, near the entrance, a different kind of tension was building. Among the small group of reporters granted access was a man who stood out, not because he was flashy, but because of the way he carried himself. He wore a sharp navy blazer and designer glasses and held his recorder like a weapon. His name wasn't important, but his reputation was, known in certain media circles for sharp-tongued interviews that often crossed the line from tough questioning into outright condescension. He'd built a following by calling out celebrities he deemed fake or out of touch, especially those who talked about social causes. To him, charity galas like this were just another stage for Hollywood to polish its halo while doing the bare minimum. He'd read the press release about Keanu's recent donation, 7 figures quietly given, no fanfare, and rolled his eyes. "Classic," he'd muttered to a colleague earlier. "Drop a few million when your new movie drops, get some good press, rinse and repeat." They all do it. He'd come tonight with one goal, to catch Keanu in a moment of contradiction, to ask a question so pointed, so loaded, that the actor's carefully constructed image of humility would crack under the pressure. He imagined the headline already. Keanu's charity genuine or just good PR? He rehearsed his line in his head, sharpening the edges, making sure it sounded clever and cutting. He watched Keanu from across the room, noting how the actor lingered near the volunteers, how he accepted a glass of water from a young woman with a grateful nod. Acting, the reporter thought dismissively. He's good at it, but I'll see through it. As the official program began and guests started moving toward the auditorium, the reporter positioned himself near the side exit Keanu would likely use. Most stars avoided the main crowd after these things. He adjusted his mic, checked his phone was recording, and waited. His heart beat a little faster, not with nerves but with the thrill of the hunt. He'd done this before, cornered actors, politicians, influencers, and watched them squirm when their polished answers failed. He expected Keanu to be the same. Defensive, maybe a little angry, or worse, to give some bland, rehearsed line about giving back. Either way, he'd have his soundbite. He'd have his story. What he didn't count on was the quiet intensity of the man himself. When Keanu finally emerged from the auditorium after the speeches, having sat through the entire thing, not slipping out early like some guests, he wasn't surrounded by handlers. He was alone again, walking slowly, his expression thoughtful, maybe even a little sad, as if the stories shared on stage had truly moved him. The reporter stepped forward, blocking his path just enough to be noticed but not enough to seem aggressive. He pasted on a thin smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Reeves," he began, his voice smooth but edged with something sharper underneath. "Quick question, if you don't mind." Keanu stopped. He didn't sigh or look annoyed. He simply turned, gave the reporter his full attention, and nodded once. Sure, that was it. No "hey man," or "what's up?" Just a calm, open, "sure." It threw the reporter off for half a second. Most celebrities at least offered a veneer of friendliness. But he recovered quickly, leaning in slightly, microphone extended like a challenge. "You've been very generous to this cause," he said, his tone dripping with false admiration. "And it's always so timely. Right around your big movie releases. Makes you wonder." He paused for effect, letting the implication hang in the air. "Do you ever worry that people might see your charity as just another part of the promotional machine? Like, is it really about helping, or is it about looking like you're helping?" The question landed like a stone in still water. A few nearby guests who'd been lingering turned to look. The volunteer handing out programs froze mid-step. Even the soft chatter from the bar seemed to quiet. The reporter held Keanu's gaze, waiting for the flinch, the defensiveness, the carefully crafted PR response. He was ready to pounce on any sign of hypocrisy. But Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't look away. Instead, his expression softened, not with anger, but with something that looked almost like pity. He studied the reporter for a long moment, not as a celebrity assessing a nuisance, but as one human being trying to understand another. Then very quietly, so only the reporter and those closest could hear, he said, "That's a heavy assumption to carry about someone you don't know." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried a weight that silenced everything else. The reporter opened his mouth to respond, to push back, to justify his question, but found himself suddenly empty. There was no malice in Keanu's words, only a quiet sadness, as if he'd seen this kind of suspicion before, and it tired him more than it angered him. Before the reporter could recover, Keanu turned slightly, not to dismiss him, but to greet a young man in a staff t-shirt who'd just approached with a hesitant smile. "Hey, you're the one who helped set up the donation drive last month, right?" Keanu asked, his whole demeanor shifting, warmer, present, engaged. The reporter stood there, microphone still raised, suddenly feeling very small, very exposed, and very much like the outsider he'd always accused others of being. The gala lights, once warm and inviting, now felt harsh, spotlighting not Keanu's supposed hypocrisy, but his own arrogance. And in that moment, as Keanu laughed softly at something the young staffer said, the reporter realized he wasn't holding a microphone anymore. He was holding a mirror. And he didn't like what he saw. The moment hung in the air like a held breath. The reporter stood frozen, mic still half raised, his rehearsed follow-up question dissolving on his tongue. He'd expected defensiveness, maybe even anger, a sharp retort, a walk-off, anything that would give him a dramatic clip to package later with a snarky headline. Instead, he got silence. Not cold silence, but the kind that comes after someone speaks a truth so plain and unguarded it leaves no room for argument. That's a heavy assumption to carry about someone you don't know. The words weren't shouted. They weren't even sharp, but they landed deep like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward in ways he hadn't prepared for. Keanu didn't wait for a reply. He turned fully toward the young staffer, a guy in his early 20s wearing a faded t-shirt with the shelter's logo, and offered a small, genuine smile. "You're the one who helped set up the donation drive last month, right?" The staffer's face lit up, surprised that Keanu remembered him. "Yeah, you showed up early that Saturday. Helped sort winter coats for hours. Didn't even tell anyone you were coming." Keanu just nodded. "Cold weather's tough out there. Every coat matters." They chatted for a minute, about the new storage space they'd secured, about how many meals they'd served that week, about a teenager who'd just gotten accepted into community college. It wasn't small talk. It was real. And the whole time Keanu listened like nothing else in the world existed. No glancing over shoulders for the next important person. No checking his phone. Just presence. Human presence. The reporter slowly lowered his microphone. His palms were sweaty. He felt like he'd just walked into a room full of people speaking a language he didn't understand. He'd come armed with cynicism, ready to dissect kindness like it was a performance. But what he'd just witnessed wasn't performance. It was connection. And it made his question, his whole approach, feel cheap. Hollow, like shouting in a library. A few feet away, a woman in a simple black dress watched the exchange. She wasn't press. She was a social worker who'd been with the shelter for over a decade. She'd seen celebrities come and go, some sincere, most not. She'd seen photo ops disguised as compassion, handshakes that lasted only long enough for the flash. But this was different. She caught the reporter's eye for a second and gave him a look. Not angry, not judgmental, just sad, like she'd seen his type before too. That look stung more than any insult. Back with Keanu, the conversation wound down naturally. The staffer thanked him again and Keanu shook his hand firmly. "Keep doing what you're doing," he said. "It matters." Then, without fanfare, he turned and walked toward the exit, hands in his pockets, shoulders relaxed, as if the confrontation had never happened. But it had happened. And the reporter couldn't unsee it. He stood there for a long moment, replaying the scene in his head. He thought about how he'd framed his question. Timely. Promotional machine. Looking like you're helping. Words chosen to imply deception. Words that assumed the worst. And Keanu's response hadn't been to defend himself, but to point gently to the flaw in the question itself. The assumption. The lack of trust. The refusal to believe someone might just care. He walked back toward the press area, but his usual swagger was gone. His colleague, another reporter who'd been filming from a distance, gave him a questioning look. "Get anything good?" he asked, already pulling up his camera feed on his phone. The first reporter didn't answer right away. He watched as Keanu paused at the door to hold it open for an older woman carrying a stack of brochures. Waited until she passed through. Said something that made her laugh. Then stepped out into the night. "Yeah," the reporter finally said, his voice quieter than usual. "I got something." But he didn't sound triumphant. He sounded unsettled. Later that night, alone in his apartment, he pulled up the raw footage on his laptop. He watched it 3 times. The first time he looked for Keanu's tell, a flicker of annoyance, a forced smile, anything that would confirm his original theory. He found nothing. The second time he focused on the staffer's face, the way his eyes lit up, the ease in his posture. This wasn't a staged moment. The third time he watched himself, and what he saw made him wince. The slight smirk before he asked the question, the way he leaned in like he was delivering a punchline, the expectation in his eyes waiting for Keanu to crack. He closed the laptop. The room felt too quiet. He thought about his usual audience, the people who tuned in for his no-nonsense takes, who loved when he called out the powerful. He imagined posting the clip with a caption like, "Keanu Reeves gets asked the hard question, see how he squirms." But now that felt wrong. It felt like lying, because Keanu hadn't squirmed. He'd stood there, calm and kind, and somehow made the question itself look ugly. He opened a blank document, started typing a draft for his outlet. At tonight's Hope for Tomorrow gala, Keanu Reeves once again demonstrated his commitment to youth homelessness. But the words felt stiff, insincere. He deleted it, tried again. Despite a pointed question about the timing of his donations, still no. It kept circling back to the accusation even when he tried to soften it. Because the truth was, the story wasn't about Keanu's donations. It was about the question, and who was really on trial. He remembered something his editor had told him once. People don't care about facts as much as they care about how you make them feel. He'd always used that to justify his sharp tone, make them feel outraged, make them feel superior. But tonight, Keanu had made people feel something else. Seen, respected, maybe even a little hopeful. And the reporter had tried to poison that. The next morning, he went into the office early. His editor was already there, coffee in hand, scrolling through overnight social media. "Hey," he said without looking up. "Saw your clip trending. Nice work." That Reeves guy didn't know what hit him. The reporter stood in the doorway. "Actually," he said, "I think I'm going to rewrite it." His editor finally looked up, eyebrows raised. Rewrite it? Why? The clip's gold. People are eating it up, are they? The reporter asked. Or are they just seeing a guy ask a mean question and get shut down with kindness? There was a pause. The editor studied him. You okay? You look like you didn't sleep. I didn't, he admitted. Because I kept thinking, what if he's just telling the truth? What if he really does this because he cares and not because it looks good? The editor leaned back in his chair. Come on, in this town, nobody gives 7 figures without wanting something back. Maybe, the reporter said slowly. But what if the thing he wants back is just to know he helped? What if that's enough? The editor snorted, but it lacked conviction. Sounds like you've been drinking the Kool-Aid. Maybe, the reporter said again. Or maybe I just forgot what it looks like when someone's actually decent. He went back to his desk. Opened a new document. This time he didn't lead with the question. He led with the moment after. The quiet conversation with the staffer. The way Keanu held the door. The fact that he stayed for the entire program while others slipped out early. He wrote about the shelter's new dormitory, about the teenager who got his GED, about Helen, the founder, and how her hands shook when she talked about losing her grandson. He mentioned the question briefly, but framed it not as a gotcha moment, but as a reminder of how quick we are to doubt goodness in a world that often rewards cynicism. He submitted it without reading it over twice. For the first time in years, he didn't care about the clicks. He cared about getting it right. Later that day, the clip from the gala started spreading. Not the edited, dramatic version he'd planned, but the full, uncut exchange. Someone had filmed it on their phone from the side. It showed the reporter's smirk, Keanu's calm response, the genuine conversation that followed. Within hours, it had thousands of shares. Comments poured in. This is why I love Keanu. Imagine being so kind even when someone's rude to you. That reporter looked like he got hit by a truck of humility. But the most telling comment came from someone who wrote, It's not that Keanu's perfect. It's that he treats people like they matter, even the ones who don't deserve it. The reporter saw that comment, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel clever. He felt seen. And maybe, just maybe, he felt the first stirrings of something he'd almost forgotten how to feel. Shame, and the quiet hope that it might lead to something better. The clip spread faster than anyone expected. Not because it was flashy or dramatic in the usual sense. There were no raised voices, no walk-offs, no angry gestures. Just a quiet moment, caught on a shaky phone camera, that somehow cut through the noise of the internet like a clear bell ringing in a crowded room. Within hours, it was everywhere, shared on social media, clipped into short reels, reposted by news outlets that usually chased scandals, not sincerity. People weren't just watching it, they were reacting to it. And what they saw wasn't a celebrity being exposed. They saw something rarer, a man choosing kindness when he could have chosen pride. At first, the reporter tried to ignore it. He told himself it was just another viral moment, that it would fade by tomorrow. But his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Notifications piled up, comments, messages, even a few emails from people he hadn't heard from in years. One message stood out. It was from his younger sister, who rarely commented on his work. She wrote, Saw the video. I know you were just doing your job, but did you really have to ask that? He looked like he'd just come from visiting someone sick. That stung more than any stranger's criticism. Because she wasn't angry, she was disappointed. And worse, she was right. He clicked on the most shared version of the clip. It had over 2 million views already. The caption read, When Keanu Reeves responds to a cynical question with pure humanity. The comment section was unlike anything he'd ever seen. No trolls, no flame wars, just people sharing stories. One person wrote about how Keanu once sat with a fan's dying mother in a hospital waiting room for over an hour, just talking, even though he was late for a meeting. Another described how he'd quietly paid for a stranger's cancer treatment after overhearing them at a diner. Someone else posted a photo of a motorcycle shop in Texas where Keanu had shown up unannounced, helped fix bikes for underprivileged kids, and refused to let them take his picture. These weren't rumors. They were specific, detailed, often backed by photos or local news clippings from years ago. Stories that had never made national headlines because Keanu never told anyone about them. He didn't post them on social media. He didn't give interviews about them. He just did them. And now in the wake of that one quiet moment at the gala, people were connecting the dots. They weren't defending Keanu because he was famous. They were defending him because over decades he'd shown again and again that his kindness wasn't a brand. It was who he was. The reporter sat back in his chair staring at the screen. He thought about his usual approach: find the flaw, highlight the hypocrisy, make people question the surface. It had worked for him. It got clicks. It built his reputation. But now, faced with a mountain of evidence that this man had been quietly helping people for 30 years, through grief, through fame, through loss, he realized something uncomfortable. His cynicism hadn't uncovered truth. It had blinded him to it. That afternoon, his editor called him into the office. "Look," the editor said, leaning forward, "the traffic's insane. People are obsessed. We should double down. Do a follow-up. The real Keanu Reeves, saint or strategist. Dig into his finances. See if there's a pattern with his donations and movie releases. Maybe talk to former co-stars, see if they've seen this generosity up close or if it's all for show." The reporter hesitated. A week ago, he would have jumped at the chance. But now the idea felt dirty. "I don't think there's a story there," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" The editor frowned. "Of course there is. Everyone's talking about it." "Yeah, but they're not talking about whether he's faking it," the reporter said. "They're talking about how rare it is to see someone act like a decent human being without wanting credit. That's the story. Not whether he's hiding some secret agenda." The editor stared at him. "Since when did you get so soft?" "I'm not soft," the reporter replied. "I'm just tired of assuming the worst about people before I even know them." There was a long silence. Finally, the editor sighed. "Fine, write what you want. But if it doesn't get numbers, we're going back to Plan A." Back at his desk, the reporter opened a new document. He didn't write about Keanu's donations. He didn't analyze his motives. Instead, he wrote about the moment itself, the weight of it, the stillness, the way a single question designed to wound had been met not with defensiveness, but with compassion so steady it felt like a challenge. He wrote about how, in a world that rewards outrage and suspicion, choosing kindness takes more courage than most people realize. And he admitted, plainly, without excuses, that he'd gotten it wrong. He titled it simply, "What Happens When You Assume the Worst and Are Proven Wrong." He hit publish before he could second-guess himself. Within an hour, the responses started rolling in. Some readers were surprised. Others thanked him for his honesty. A few longtime followers unfollowed, calling him weak or sold out, but most of the comments were thoughtful. One person wrote, "It takes guts to admit you misjudged someone. Thanks for showing us that even critics can grow." Another said, "This is why I still believe in people. Not because they're perfect, but because they can change." Meanwhile, Keanu remained completely unaware of the storm he'd unintentionally stirred. He wasn't checking headlines or reading comments. He was in a small community center on the east side of the city, sitting on a folding chair in a circle with a group of teenagers from the shelter program. They were talking about goals, fears, what they wanted their lives to look like in 5 years. He didn't offer advice unless asked. Mostly he listened. When one young man talked about wanting to be an electrician, but not knowing how to afford trade school, Keanu didn't make a grand promise. He just said, "I know a guy who runs a training program. Want me to connect you?" The kid's eyes widened. "Seriously?" Keanu nodded. "Seriously." Later, as he walked out, a staff member stopped him. "You know that clip from the gala is all over the internet, right?" Keanu just shrugged. "Oh, yeah, I heard something about that." He didn't ask for details. He didn't seem concerned. "People have a lot of opinions," he said gently. "But the work's what matters, not the noise." Back in his apartment that night, the reporter scrolled through more stories people had shared about Keanu. One stood out. Years ago, after the death of his partner and their newborn daughter, Keanu disappeared from the public eye for months. When he finally returned, he didn't give interviews about his grief. Instead, he started showing up at children's hospitals, spending hours with kids fighting cancer, just sitting with them, playing games, listening to their fears. He never told the press. A nurse had only mentioned it years later in a local newspaper interview, saying, "He didn't come for photos. He came because he knew what it felt like to lose someone you love." The reporter closed his laptop. He walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to dissect, to doubt, to tear down. He just felt quiet, and in that quiet, something shifted. He thought about the shelter, about the kids Keanu had helped, about the woman who'd lost her grandson. He thought about his own life, how much time he'd spent looking for cracks in people's armor instead of seeing the humanity underneath. He picked up his phone, scrolled to the contacts, found the number for the Hope for Tomorrow shelter, took a breath, and dialed. "Hi," he said when someone answered. "I'm calling to see if you need any volunteers." There was a pause on the other end. "We always do," came the warm reply. "When can you start?" "Tomorrow," he said. If that's okay, he hung up. Didn't post about it, didn't tell his editor. Just sat back down, feeling lighter than he had in years. Outside, the city hummed on, full of noise and chaos and judgment. But inside, for the first time in a long time, there was peace. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something better. The days that followed felt strange, like walking through a world that had tilted slightly on its axis. The reporter kept expecting the usual rush of online drama to fade, replaced by the next scandal, the next outrage. But this time it didn't. The clip kept circulating not as gossip, but as something people returned to, like a quiet reminder in a noisy world. Memes popped up, but they weren't mocking. One showed Keanu holding a door open with the caption, "When your entire personality is just being a good human." Another simply read, "Be more Keanu." Even late-night hosts mentioned it, not to joke but to reflect. Imagine if we all responded to meanness with calm instead of more meanness. At first, the attention made the reporter uneasy. He'd spent years building a persona, the sharp-tongued truth-teller who wasn't afraid to ask the hard questions. Now strangers were calling him out, not for being too harsh, but for missing the point entirely. Comments flooded his social media. You asked if his kindness was real like it was a trick question. He didn't even get mad. He just cared more than you expected. One message from someone who said they worked at a shelter in Chicago hit hardest. "People like him keep places like ours running. We don't need your skepticism. We need your help." He didn't delete the comments. He read everyone, and slowly something inside him began to soften, not just from guilt, but from a dawning realization. His job had stopped being about truth a long time ago. It had become about winning, about proving he was smarter, sharper, more awake than the people he interviewed. But real truth wasn't found in tearing others down. It was found in listening, in seeing. He started showing up at the shelter the next week just like he'd promised. He didn't tell anyone who he was. He wore old jeans and a plain t-shirt, tied an apron around his waist, and helped serve dinner in the community kitchen. At first he felt awkward, out of place among people who'd known real struggle, who didn't care about headlines or viral moments. But no one treated him differently. They just handed him a ladle and said, "Soup's getting cold." As the nights went by, he began to notice things. The way the kitchen manager remembered everyone's name and their favorite meal. How a teenager who barely spoke to anyone would light up when someone asked about his drawings. How the volunteers didn't just hand out food. They asked how people's days had been, listened to their worries, made them feel seen. It wasn't charity as performance. It was care as practice. Daily, ordinary, unglamorous care. One evening, as he was wiping down tables after dinner, an older man sat down across from him. He'd been coming to the shelter for months, quiet, always in the back. Tonight, he looked the reporter in the eye and said, "You're new here, huh?" "Yeah," the reporter said. "Just trying to help." The man nodded slowly. "Most people come for a day, take a few photos, feel good about themselves, and leave. You've been here 5 nights straight. That means something." The reporter didn't know what to say. He just shrugged. "It's the least I can do." "Maybe," the man said. "But least is more than most give." Those words stayed with him all the way home. Back at his desk the next morning, his editor slid a printout across the table. It was a screenshot of a popular entertainment blog. The headline read, "Reporter who challenged Keanu Reeves reportedly volunteering at youth shelter. Redemption arc or PR stunt?" Below it, comments were already speculating. He's just trying to fix his image. Classic damage control. Wait till his next article. Bet it's all glowing now. The reporter felt his stomach drop. He hadn't told anyone about volunteering. He hadn't posted a single photo, but someone must have recognized him. And just like that, his quiet attempt to make things right was being twisted into another performance. His editor raised an eyebrow. "So is it a stunt?" "No," the reporter said firmly. "It's not." "Then prove it," the editor said. "Write about it, own it. Show people you mean it." But the reporter shook his head. "If I write about it, it becomes about me again. And this isn't about me. It's about them." He gestured toward the shelter, though it was miles away. "They don't need my story. They need support." The editor studied him for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he nodded. "All right. Keep doing your thing, just don't disappear on us." That weekend, the reporter returned to the shelter. He helped organize donated clothes, sorted canned goods, even played chess with a shy kid who barely spoke English. No cameras, no notes, just presence. And in those quiet hours, he began to understand what Keanu had meant that night at the gala. Kindness wasn't about being seen. It was about showing up, consistently, quietly, without expectation. Meanwhile, the online conversation kept evolving. A former motorcycle mechanic posted a long thread about the time Keanu showed up at his shop years ago, not as a celebrity, but as a fellow rider who wanted to learn. He'd spent weeks working alongside the crew, fixing bikes, sharing tools, never asking for special treatment. When the shop fell on hard times, Keanu quietly wired enough money to keep it open, on the condition that no one ever knew it came from him. The mechanic only found out years later, by accident, when an old bank statement surfaced during a move. Another story came from a woman whose brother had been in a coma after a car accident. Keanu, who'd heard about it through a mutual friend, visited the hospital every week for 3 months, not to take photos, not to make a statement, but just to sit with the family, bring coffee, and talk about anything but the tragedy. When the brother finally woke up, Keanu was there, but he slipped out before anyone could thank him properly. These stories weren't new. They'd been whispered for years in small towns and repair shops and hospital waiting rooms. But now, in the wake of that one quiet moment at the gala, people felt safe sharing them, not to build a myth, but to say, "This is real. This man is real." The reporter read them all, and each one chipped away at the wall he'd built around his own heart, the wall that said everyone has an angle, everyone's faking something. Maybe some people were, but not this one. And if someone like Keanu could move through the world with that much quiet grace, maybe the rest of us could try too. One rainy Tuesday, as he was leaving the shelter, he saw a familiar figure walking toward the entrance. It was Keanu. Not in a suit this time, but in a worn leather jacket, jeans, and boots. He carried a paper bag, probably groceries or supplies. He nodded to the security guard, exchanged a few words with a staff member, then disappeared inside without fanfare. The reporter didn't approach him. He didn't pull out his phone. He just stood there for a moment, watching the rain fall, and felt something shift inside him. Not admiration exactly, but respect. Not for the fame, not for the money, but for the consistency. For showing up again and again, not because it looked good, but because it mattered. He walked to his car, got in, and sat for a long time. Then he pulled out his notebook, not his work one, but a small personal journal he hadn't touched in years. He wrote 2 lines. "I used to think kindness was weakness. Now I see it's the bravest thing of all." He didn't publish it. He didn't tweet it. He just closed the book, started the engine, and drove home through the rain, feeling lighter than he had in years. Outside, the city kept moving, loud, chaotic, often unkind. But inside him, something quiet had taken root. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just trying to be better. Months passed. The internet moved on as it always does. New controversies, new celebrities, new outrage cycles bloomed and faded like wildflowers in a storm. The clip from the gala still surfaced now and then, usually when someone needed a reminder that decency still existed, but it was no longer trending. It had settled into something quieter, more lasting. A reference point. A shared moment of collective pause in a world that rarely stops shouting. Keanu Reeves, as always, remained out of the spotlight, not because he avoided it, but because he simply didn't live inside it. He didn't give interviews about the incident. He didn't post about his charity work. He just kept doing it. One morning, he was spotted at a small community center on the edge of the city. Not for a photo op, but for the opening of a new after-school tutoring room funded by one of his quiet donations. There were no cameras, no red carpet, just a folding table with juice boxes and cookies. He spent most of the time kneeling on the floor, helping a little boy tie his shoelaces, his fingers moving with patient care, his voice soft as he explained the loops and pulls. A staff member later said he stayed for over an hour, playing board games with kids, listening to their stories about school, asking about their dreams. When he left, he walked to the bus stop down the street and waited like anyone else, hands in his pockets, head slightly bowed against the morning chill. No one made a big deal of it. No headlines, no viral post, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Meanwhile, the reporter's life had changed in ways he never expected. Not dramatically, but deeply. He still worked in media, but his approach had shifted. He stopped chasing gotcha moments. Instead, he started looking for stories that showed people trying, really trying to make things better, even in small ways. He wrote about a retired teacher who tutored kids for free in her garage, about a group of neighbors who turned an empty lot into a community garden, about a former addict who now ran a support group from his living room. His editor was skeptical at first, but the pieces resonated. Readers wrote in saying they felt hopeful after reading them. One message simply said, "Thank you for reminding me that good people are still out there." He kept volunteering at the shelter, not as a one-time act of redemption, but as part of his routine. He learned the names of the regulars, remembered who liked extra gravy on their mashed potatoes, who needed help filling out job applications. He didn't talk about it online. He didn't use it as content. It was just something he did, because it felt right, because it grounded him, because it reminded him that real life happened not in headlines, but in shared meals, quiet conversations, and small acts of care. One evening, as he was helping serve dinner, a young woman approached him. She'd been coming to the shelter for a few weeks, quiet, always sitting alone. Tonight she held out a folded piece of paper. "I saw you reading that book last week," she said shyly. "I wrote something. If you want to read it." He took it, surprised. Later, in the dim light of the kitchen office, he unfolded it. It was a short poem about feeling invisible, about walking through the world like a ghost until someone looked you in the eye and said your name. At the bottom, she'd written, "Thanks for seeing me." He folded it carefully and put it in his wallet. He still carries it. Back at his desk one afternoon, his editor handed him a new assignment. "There's a profile piece coming up on Reeves," he said. "Not about the movies, about his quiet giving. They want someone who's seen both sides." The reporter hesitated. "I don't think I'm the right person." "Why not?" the editor asked. "You asked the hard question. You saw what happened after. You changed because of it. That's the story." But the reporter shook his head. "If I write about him, it'll become about me again, and he doesn't deserve that. His work speaks for itself. It doesn't need my explanation or my apology." The editor thought for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough." Instead, the reporter suggested they feature the shelter itself, the people who ran it, the lives it had changed. The editor agreed. The resulting article was one of the most read pieces the outlet had published in months. Not because it was flashy, but because it was true, and human time kept moving. Seasons changed. The reporter stopped thinking of himself as the guy who challenged Keanu Reeves. He was just a person trying to do better, one small choice at a time. He still made mistakes. He still had doubts. But he no longer led with suspicion. He tried to lead with curiosity, with openness, with the understanding that everyone carries unseen weight, and kindness costs nothing but can mean everything. One crisp fall morning, he arrived at the shelter early to help set up for a job fair. As he was arranging brochures on a table, he looked up and saw Keanu walking in, not as a guest of honor, but as a volunteer, carrying a box of donated professional clothes. Their eyes met for just a second. Keanu gave a small, quiet nod, not a celebrity acknowledging a critic, just one person recognizing another who'd shown up. The reporter nodded back. No words were needed. Later, as Keanu helped a young man pick out a suit for an interview, offering quiet encouragement and adjusting the collar with gentle hands, the reporter watched from across the room. There was no performance, no awareness of being observed, just two people connecting in a moment that mattered only to them. And in that ordinary, unremarkable scene, the reporter finally understood what so many had tried to tell him. Goodness doesn't need a spotlight to be real. It just needs to be lived. He turned back to his table, straightened the brochures, and got back to work. Not for praise, not for redemption, but because it was the right thing to do. Outside, the city buzzed with noise and hurry. But inside the shelter there was something quieter, stronger, the steady rhythm of people choosing to care. Again and again, without fanfare, without expectation, simply because it mattered. And in that choice, both Keanu and the reporter, and countless others like them, had found something rare in today's world. Not fame, not victory, but peace. The kind that comes not from being right, but from becoming better. Not from winning an argument, but from learning to listen. And in the end, that was the only story worth telling. The story should have ended with part 5. It was complete, quiet, human, and true to the arc of humility, reflection, and quiet change. But life rarely wraps up in neat chapters. Sometimes, long after the cameras leave and the headlines fade, something small happens that echoes louder than any grand finale ever could. It began on an ordinary Tuesday morning, months after the gala. Months after the viral clip had settled into internet memory like an old photograph tucked in a drawer. The reporter, no longer thinking of himself that way, just a person trying to live with more care, was walking to the shelter earlier than usual. He'd started coming before sunrise sometimes, helping prep breakfast for the early arrivals, night shift workers heading home, teens with nowhere else to go before school, people just trying to get through another day. The streets were still quiet, the sky pale with the promise of dawn. As he turned the corner onto the shelter's block, he saw a figure already there, standing near the back entrance. It was Keanu, not in a suit, not even in his usual leather jacket, but in a simple hoodie and jeans holding 2 paper bags. Steam rose from them, coffee maybe, and breakfast sandwiches. He was talking quietly with the overnight security guard, the kind of conversation that wasn't rushed, wasn't performative, just 2 people sharing a moment before the day began. The reporter slowed his steps. He didn't want to interrupt. He didn't want to be seen watching. So he lingered near a bus stop bench, pretending to check his phone, though his eyes kept drifting back. What struck him wasn't what Keanu was doing. It was how he was doing it. There was no sense of duty, no hint of obligation. He leaned against the brick wall like he belonged there, like this was just another morning in a long line of mornings. He laughed at something the guard said, a soft, warm sound that carried in the still air. Then he handed over one of the bags, patted the man on the shoulder, and turned to leave. But before he walked away, he paused. Looked up at the shelter's windows, some still dark, others with faint light behind thin curtains. For a long moment he just stood there quiet, as if holding the place in his thoughts. Then he nodded slightly, like a silent promise, and walked off down the street, hands in his pockets, disappearing into the morning light. The reporter didn't move for a full minute. He'd seen generosity before, big checks, grand announcements, red carpet moments. But this was different. This was showing up when no one was watching. This was care without an audience. And it hit him harder than any speech ever could. Inside the shelter, the morning unfolded as usual. Volunteers arrived, coffee brewed, the kitchen filled with the clatter of pots and quiet greetings. The reporter helped set out trays of toast and fruit, his mind still on what he'd seen outside. Later, as he was wiping down tables, the overnight guard came in, still holding the paper bag. He does this every few weeks, the guard said casually, unwrapping a sandwich. Never says much. Just shows up with coffee and food. Says the night crew gets forgotten. The reporter nodded. He didn't even know I was there. Probably didn't care either way, the guard said with a small smile. That's the thing about him. He's not here for us to see him. He's here because he sees us. Those words stayed with him all day. Weeks later, the shelter hosted a small gathering to celebrate a milestone, the opening of a new wing for young adults aging out of foster care. It wasn't a gala. No press, no celebrities announced. Just cake, a few speeches, and a room full of people who'd fought hard for a second chance. The reporter helped set up chairs, hung handmade banners, and made sure there was enough lemonade. Halfway through the event, he noticed Keanu sitting in the back row, not on a stage or at a VIP table, but among the guests, next to a young woman who'd aged out of the system 2 years ago and now worked part-time at the front desk. They were talking quietly, heads bent together like old friends. Later, the reporter overheard her telling someone, "He remembered my name, from 6 months ago. When I was scared to even walk through the door, no one made a fuss. No phones were pulled out. The moment passed like any other. Ordinary, unrecorded, real." That night, back at his apartment, the reporter sat at his desk with a blank page in front of him. Not for work, just for himself. He'd been thinking a lot about legacy, not the kind measured in followers or headlines, but in the quiet ripples we leave behind. How one act of kindness could echo in someone's life, long after it's forgotten by the world. How showing up consistently and without fanfare could mean more than any grand gesture. He thought about the young woman who'd aged out of foster care, about the overnight guard who felt seen, about the little boy whose shoelaces Keanu had tied, about the countless others whose lives had been touched in ways no camera ever captured. And he thought about himself, not as the reporter who'd asked the wrong question, but as someone who'd been given a second chance to see clearly. He picked up his pen and wrote, "The world shouts for attention, but the people who change it, they whisper." He didn't publish it. He didn't post it. He just closed the notebook and placed it on his shelf. Time kept moving. Seasons turned. The reporter kept volunteering. Keanu kept showing up, sometimes seen, often not. Their paths crossed only a few more times, always briefly, always without drama. A nod in the hallway. A shared smile over a tray of food. No apologies, no explanations. Just mutual respect between two people who'd learned, in different ways, that humility isn't weakness, it's the foundation of real connection. Years later, long after the internet had forgotten the clip, long after the shelter had expanded into a full community hub, a new volunteer arrived. A college student writing a paper on grassroots support systems. During orientation, she asked the longtime staff member, "Is it true Keanu Reeves helps here?" The staff member smiled. "He does, but not how you think. He doesn't come for photos. He comes to listen, to help, to be human." The student looked around the bustling center, kids doing homework, adults in job workshops, volunteers laughing in the kitchen. "It feels real here," she said. "It is," the staff member replied, "because the people who built it didn't want credit. They just wanted to help. And in that moment, the legacy wasn't in a viral video or a headline. It was in the quiet hum of a place where people were treated like they mattered, simply because they did." The reporter, now gray at the temples but still showing up every Tuesday, overheard the exchange from the kitchen. He smiled to himself as he stirred a pot of soup. He didn't need to say anything. The work spoke for itself. And somewhere out there in the world, Keanu was probably doing the same, kneeling to tie a child's shoe, buying coffee for a stranger, sitting quietly with someone who felt alone, not because he wanted to be remembered, but because it was the right thing to do. And in a world that often confuses noise with importance, that quiet choice, to care without needing to be seen, remains the most powerful story of all.